The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its red earth cracked and barren from months without rain. Buzzards circled overhead, waiting patiently for death to claim another victim of the brutal frontier. In this wasteland, where Apache families starved and cowboys ruled with iron fists, survival meant choosing between honor and hunger every single day. KIYAH, a once proud Apache warrior now reduced to skin and bones, stumbled through the thorny brush, searching for anything that might keep his people alive another day. His ribs showed through his weathered skin. His legs trembled with each step, but his dark eyes still burned with the fierce spirit of his ancestors. What he witnessed next would change everything. A sight so horrifying, so unthinkable, that even a starving man would risk his own life to stop it. But would one Apache's desperate act of courage save an innocent child, or doom his entire tribe to extinction? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. KIYAH's bare feet found purchase on the rocky outcrop as he crested the small hill, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The torn leather medicine pouch at his waist bounced against his hip with each labored step. Its sacred contents, what little remained of his grandmother's healing herbs, rustling like dried leaves in autumn wind. The pouch had been whole once, blessed by the medicine man before KIYAH's first war party. Now it hung in tatters, much like everything else from his former life. Below him, in a shallow wash carved by long-forgotten flash floods, KIYAH saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins despite the desert heat. A white man, a cowboy by his dress and bearing, dragged a small figure through the coarse sand and scattered stones. The child's legs scraped against the ground, leaving twin trails of disturbed earth behind her small body. Jake Morrison spat tobacco juice and cursed as he yanked the rope binding the girl's wrists. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her dark hair matted with dust and tears, her simple cotton dress torn and stained. Mexican by her appearance, probably taken during one of the recent raids on the border settlements. "Stop! You're squirming, you little wildcat," Jake growled, giving the rope another vicious jerk that sent the child tumbling face first into a patch of prickly pear cactus. She cried out in Spanish, words that KIYAH didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in any language: pain, terror, desperation. The cowboy laughed, a sound like grinding stone that made KIYAH's jaw clench. "They'll pay good money for you down in Nogales, girl. Fresh meat always brings top dollar, and you're pretty enough once we clean you up." KIYAH's vision blurred, and for a moment he wasn't seeing this Mexican child, but another girl, smaller, with the distinctive features of his own people. Ayanna, his daughter. She had been 6 when the soldiers came, 6 when they forced the entire band onto the reservation, 6 when the spotted sickness took her along with half the children that first terrible winter. He blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. This wasn't Ayanna. Ayanna was beyond saving, her small body buried in ground too hard for proper Apache rites. But this child, Elena, he heard Jake call her when she whimpered a word in Spanish. This child still drew breath. The cowboy stopped, to rest, tying his horse's reins to a stunted mesquite tree. He pulled a flask from his saddlebags and took a long drink, while Elena curled into a ball, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jake studied her with the calculating look of a man assessing livestock. 3 more hours to the trading post, he said, more to himself than to the girl. Martinez will have his buyers waiting. Shouldn't be too particular about a few scrapes and bruises. Elena lifted her head, and KIYAH saw her face clearly for the first time. Despite the dirt and tears, despite the cuts from the cactus spines, she possessed the same determined spirit he had once seen in Ayanna's eyes. The same refusal to surrender completely, even in the face of overwhelming evil. Jake finished his drink and stood, reaching for the rope. Come on then, merchandise. Time to... The cowboy never finished his sentence. Later, KIYAH would not remember making the decision to move. His body acted on instincts older than thought, deeper than the civilized restraint that might have counseled caution. One moment he crouched on the hillside, weak from hunger and hidden by shadow. The next, he was sliding down the gravelly slope. In absolute silence, his father's obsidian knife, the only possession of value he still carried, gripped in his right hand. Jake Morrison had no idea death approached on bare feet until the Apache warrior's arm locked around his throat from behind. The cowboy's hand went instinctively to his gun, but KIYAH's blade found the gap between his ribs before his fingers could clear leather. The steel whispered through cloth and flesh with the same deadly efficiency KIYAH had perfected in a dozen raids against the Mexicans and bluecoats. But Jake Morrison was stronger than he looked and meaner than a cornered rattler. Instead of falling, he threw his weight backward, slamming KIYAH against the mesquite tree with bone-jarring force. The obsidian knife flew from numbed fingers as both men crashed to the ground, rolling in the dust and fighting for their lives with the desperate fury of wounded animals. Elena screamed. Jake Morrison was no stranger to violence, but he had never fought a man with nothing left to lose. KIYAH rolled away from the tree, his father's obsidian knife glinting in the harsh sunlight just beyond reach. The cowboy's hand found his Colt .45, clearing leather with practiced speed, but the Apache was already moving. KIYAH dove low, tackling Jake around the knees and sending them both sprawling again. The revolver discharged skyward with a thunderous crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Elena scrambled backward on her bound hands, her dark eyes wide with terror as she watched two grown men fight to the death over her fate. "You red devil!" Jake snarled, bringing his gun hand down toward KIYAH's skull. The Apache caught his wrist just inches from impact, and they strained against each other, trembling with effort. Jake was bigger and better fed, but KIYAH fought with the desperate strength of a man protecting something sacred. The obsidian blade lay 3 feet away, its black surface drinking in the desert sun. KIYAH's grandfather had napped it from volcanic glass found in the sacred mountains, had blessed it with prayers older than memory. 4 generations of Apache warriors had carried it into battle. Now it might claim its final victim in defense of a Mexican child who couldn't even speak KIYAH's language. Jake's superior size began to tell. The revolver inched closer to KIYAH's face. The cowboy's lips peeled back in a feral grin that revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "Gonna put you down like the mangy dog you are, then finish what I started with the girl." The words ignited something primal in KIYAH's chest. He thought of Ayanna, of all the Apache children who had died while white men watched and did nothing. He thought of his wife, Ayanna, wasting away on government rations that came spoiled more often than not. He thought of his people, scattered like seeds on barren ground, forgotten by the world that had once feared their war cry. With a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, KIYAH released Jake's gun hand and rolled toward his knife. The cowboy's shot went wild, kicking up sand where the Apache had been a heartbeat before. KIYAH's fingers closed around the obsidian handle just as Jake's boot caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs in an explosive gasp. But now KIYAH held his father's blade, and the spirit of every warrior who had wielded it flowed through his weakened frame. He swept the knife in a wide arc, opening a red line across Jake's thigh. The cowboy stumbled backward, cursing, his gun wavering as blood soaked through his pants. "You cut me, you savage son of a—" KIYAH struck like a sidewinder, low and fast. The obsidian blade punched through leather vest and cotton shirt, finding the soft flesh beneath Jake's ribs. The cowboy's eyes went wide with shock and pain. His gun hand shook as he tried to bring the weapon to bear, but KIYAH twisted the knife, angling upward toward the heart. Jake Morrison had terrorized Mexican settlements for 3 years, had sold children into slavery without a moment's remorse, had laughed as he dragged Elena through the dirt like discarded refuse. But as he looked into KIYAH's black eyes, he saw something that made his bowels turn to water, not just death, but judgment. The obsidian blade found its mark. Jake's final breath rattled in his throat as he toppled backward, his blood darkening the desert sand. His gun fell from nerveless fingers, clattering against the stones with metallic finality. KIYAH knelt beside the dead cowboy, breathing hard. His ribs ached where Jake's boot had connected, and he could feel warm blood seeping from a dozen small cuts. But he was alive, and more importantly, so was the child. Elena had pressed herself against the canyon wall, as far from the violence as her bonds would allow. She stared at KIYAH with a mixture of terror and confusion, not understanding if he was her savior or simply another predator. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, and tears had carved clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. KIYAH slowly sheathed his father's knife and approached her with the same care he might use with a wounded animal. She flinched when he reached for the rope binding her wrists, babbling something in rapid Spanish that sounded like a prayer. "Shh," KIYAH whispered in his own language, though he doubted she understood. His hands, still steady despite everything, worked at the knots Jake had tied with cruel efficiency. "You are safe now, little one. The bad man cannot hurt you anymore." Elena's bonds fell away, leaving angry red welts around her tiny wrists. She rubbed the feeling back into her hands while studying this strange, gaunt man who had killed to protect her. Something in his weathered face must have reassured her, because she stopped crying. KIYAH's hands shook as he tore strips from Jake Morrison's shirt, pressing the cleanest pieces against the knife wound in his side. The blade had gone deeper than he'd first realized, and dark blood seeped between his fingers with each labored breath. He had won the fight, but victory might still kill him if he couldn't stop the bleeding. Elena sat in the shade of the mesquite tree, her small fingers wrapped around a wooden cross that hung from her neck, the only possession Jake hadn't bothered to steal. The carved wood was smooth and dark with age, worn by countless worried fingers. She clutched it now like a lifeline, her lips moving in silent Spanish prayers that KIYAH couldn't understand, but recognized as pleas for protection. The child watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. She had seen him kill a man to save her, but she didn't know what came next. To her, KIYAH was just another stranger in a land where strangers meant danger. His Apache features, his weathered buckskins, his long black hair bound with leather, all of it marked him as something she had been taught to fear. KIYAH tried to remember the few Spanish words he had learned during his raiding days, but pain made thinking difficult. No miedo, he finally managed, hoping he had the words right. No fear. Elena's grip on the cross tightened, but she didn't run. That was something, at least. The cowboy's horse stood patiently nearby, trained to wait for a master who would never mount again. Its saddlebags might contain food, water, supplies, things that could mean the difference between life and death in the desert. But first, KIYAH had to decide what to do with the girl. The smart choice would be to point her toward the nearest Mexican settlement and wish her well. She wasn't his responsibility, wasn't his blood, wasn't his tribe. The Apache were barely surviving as it was, taking on another mouth to feed, especially one that couldn't even speak their language, bordered on madness. But when KIYAH looked at Elena, he saw Ayana's face in the shadow of the mesquite tree. His daughter had been about the same age when the fever took her, had possessed the same determined spirit that refused to surrender even in the face of impossible odds. The memory hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over until he had to grip his knees to stay upright. Ayana had held their daughter's burning body for 3 days and nights, singing the old songs and refusing to accept that the spirits had called Ayana home. When death finally claimed the child, his wife's sanity went with her. She never spoke again, never acknowledged KIYAH's presence, never responded to anything in the world of the living. She died 6 months later, as surely as if the same fever had taken them both. Elena made a small sound, not quite a whimper, but close. She was studying KIYAH's face with the intuitive understanding children possessed, recognizing grief even when they couldn't name its source. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and touched his arm with one small finger. The gesture broke something inside KIYAH's chest. This child, terrified and alone, was trying to comfort him. She had no reason to trust any adult after what Jake had done to her, yet something in her recognized a kindred spirit in another lost soul. "Elena," KIYAH said softly, remembering the name Jake had used. The girl nodded, apparently surprised he knew it. He pointed to himself and said, "KIYAH." She tried to repeat it, her accent making it sound like KIYAH, but close enough. He struggled to his feet, testing his weight on legs that still trembled from the fight. The wound in his side burned like fire, but it had stopped bleeding heavily. He would live, probably, if infection didn't set in. Now came the hard choice. KIYAH looked south toward the Mexican settlements, then north toward the hidden canyon where his tribe scraped out their desperate existence. Elena couldn't survive alone in the desert, that much was certain. But bringing her to the Apache camp would create problems he might not be able to solve. Chief Neshoba was a practical man who understood that sentiment was a luxury his people couldn't afford. Some of the younger warriors, like Takoda, had already suggested trading captured settlers for supplies or safe passage. A Mexican child might be seen as exactly the kind of opportunity the tribe needed. But KIYAH had made his choice the moment he slid down that hillside with his father's knife in his hand. Elena was under his protection now, whatever the cost. He walked to Jake's horse and began searching the saddlebags, pulling out jerky, hardtack, a canteen half full of water, and a small leather pouch containing silver coins. Enough to sustain them on the journey north, if they were careful. Elena watched him work, still fingering her wooden cross. When he gestured for her to come, she hesitated for only a moment before standing and walking to his side. The Apache camp lay hidden in a narrow canyon where ancient waters had carved sheltering walls from red sandstone. Smoke from carefully tended fires rose in thin wisps, dissipating quickly in the desert wind to avoid detection by cavalry patrols. It was a place of shadows and whispers, where a once proud people learned the bitter art of invisibility. KIYAH approached the sentries with Elena walking beside him, her small hand gripping his weathered fingers with surprising strength. The child had not spoken during their 2-day journey north, but she had learned to trust this gaunt Apache warrior who shared his meager water ration and fashioned her a shelter each night from his own blanket. Yognalnish, barely 16 and eager to prove his worth as a warrior, stepped from behind a boulder with his rifle raised. His eyes widened when he saw Elena, then narrowed with suspicion and confusion. "KIYAH, what is this?" "A child who needs protection," KIYAH replied simply, his hand moving instinctively to the eagle feather headband that marked his former status as war chief. The feathers were molted and faded now, like everything else from the time before the reservation, but they still carried weight among his people. "Tell Chief Neshoba that I have returned with important news." Word of KIYAH's arrival spread through the camp like wildfire. Apache faces appeared at the entrances of brush shelters and behind makeshift windbreaks. Men, women and children emerged from the shadows to stare at the impossible sight, their respected warrior returning with a Mexican child in tow. Elena pressed closer to KIYAH as dozens of dark eyes studied her, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. She couldn't understand their rapid Apache words, but the tone carried meaning that transcended language. Some voices held wonder, others suspicion, and a few carried the sharp edge of anger. Chief Neshoba emerged from the largest shelter at the canyon's heart, his presence commanding immediate silence. Though only in his 50s, the chief's hair had gone completely white during the years of exile, and deep lines mapped the geography of loss across his weathered face. He wore the traditional headband of leadership, but the sacred eagle feathers had been replaced by simple hawk plumes. The great eagles were all gone from this part of the desert, driven away like everything else the Apache had once called their own. "KIYAH," Neshoba said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a leader who must weigh every word. "You have been gone many days. We feared the worst. I encountered difficulties, my chief. This child was in great danger. I could not leave her to die." Dakota stepped forward from the gathered crowd, his young face twisted with barely contained fury. At 25, he had been born into war and knew nothing but struggle and deprivation. The eagle feather in his own headband was genuine, taken from a bird he had killed with his bare hands during his vision quest, and it marked him as a warrior of exceptional courage and growing influence. A Mexican child? Dakota's voice carried like a whip crack across the canyon. While our own people starve, you bring us another mouth to feed. Have you forgotten what the Mexicans did to our families at Tres Castillos? Have you forgotten how they sold Apache children to the slavers? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Elena might not understand the words, but she could read the hostility in Dakota's stance, in the way other warriors nodded at his accusations. She moved behind KIYAH's legs, peering around him like a frightened animal seeking shelter. Old Ayana, the camp's medicine woman and keeper of traditional wisdom, pushed through the crowd with the authority of age and sacred knowledge. Her ancient hands were stained with the herbs and roots that comprised her healing arsenal, and her eyes held the deep understanding that came from witnessing 7 decades of Apache history. "What is the child's story?" she asked, ignoring Dakota's glare. "No warrior of KIYAH's wisdom would burden us without good reason." KIYAH briefly recounted his encounter with Jake Morrison, the cowboys' plan to sell Elena into slavery, and the fight that ended with a dead white man and a rescued child. He spoke simply, without embellishment, but the details painted a clear picture of evil thwarted by desperate courage. "The white man is dead?" Chief Neshoba asked, his expression grave. "His people will come looking for him, perhaps. But if we had left the child to her fate, would we still be Apache? Or would we have become something else, something our ancestors would not recognize?" Dakota stepped closer, his hand resting on his knife handle. "Pretty words, old man. But words will not feed this child when our own children cry with hunger. Words will not stop the cavalry when they come seeking revenge for their dead countrymen." Elena's grip on KIYAH's fingers tightened as the confrontation escalated around her. She was too young to fully understand the political implications of her presence, but she knew she had become the center of something dangerous and divisive. The sacred council pipe lay in the center of the gathering circle, its red clay bowl cracked from years of hardship and hasty relocations. Once it had been perfect, carved by Neshoba's grandfather and blessed with prayers that connected the living to the spirits of the ancestors. Now it resembled everything else in the Apache world, broken but still functional, damaged but not destroyed. Chief Neshoba lifted the pipe with reverent hands, packing it with the last of their ceremonial tobacco. The sweet smoke that would normally carry their prayers skyward was rationed now, save for only the most critical decisions. Elena's fate certainly qualified. The tribal council formed a loose circle around the central fire, their faces painted in flickering orange light that emphasized every line of hardship and loss. KIYAH sat with Elena pressed against his side, the child's dark eyes darting nervously between the assembled Apache faces. She couldn't understand their words, but the gravity of the moment was universal. "We gather to decide the fate of this Mexican child," Neshoba began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of tribal law. "KIYAH has brought her to us, seeking protection. We must decide if this protection serves the interests of our people." Dakota was first to speak, rising with the fluid grace of a born warrior. "I have seen Mexican children sold in the slave markets of Nogales. They bring good prices, enough to buy rifles, ammunition, horses, enough to equip our warriors for the battles ahead." A murmur of agreement rippled through some of the younger men. They had never known abundance, had grown up watching their people diminish with each passing season. To them, Elena represented opportunity rather than obligation. "This child could feed our families for a month," continued another warrior, Bidzil. "Or we could trade her for safe passage through Mexican territory. The federales would look favorably on our return of stolen property." Elena pressed closer to KIYAH, sensing the hostile undercurrents in voices she couldn't understand. Her wooden cross caught the firelight, and several of the Apache noticed her unconscious gesture of faith. To them, it represented everything foreign and threatening about the world beyond their hidden canyon. Old Ayana raised her weathered hand for silence. "I have dreamed of this child," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came with being the tribe's spiritual guardian. "3 nights ago, the spirits showed me a small light in a great darkness. I did not understand the vision then, but now I see its meaning." The medicine woman's words carried weight that political arguments could not match. Even Takoda fell silent, though his expression remained skeptical. "What did the spirits tell you, grandmother?" Chief Neshoba asked, using the traditional term of respect. "That sometimes the greatest strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. That our honor is not measured by our ability to survive, but by what we choose to preserve of our humanity while we survive." KIYAH felt Elena relax slightly against his side. The child couldn't understand Ayana's words, but something in the old woman's tone suggested advocacy rather than condemnation. "The spirits also warned of a choice," Ayana continued. "We can remain Apache in name only, trading our souls for temporary advantage. Or we can remember what it means to be the people our ancestors would recognize, even if that choice brings hardship." Chief Neshoba drew slowly on the sacred pipe, the tobacco glowing red in the clay bowl. The smoke rose straight up in the still canyon air, carrying their deliberations toward the star-scattered sky. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of leadership forged in impossible circumstances. "I have heard wisdom from both sides of this fire. Takoda speaks truth. We are few and growing fewer. Every decision must serve our survival. But Ayana also speaks truth. Survival without honor is not truly life." He passed the pipe to his left, beginning the formal process that would give every council member a voice in the decision. Each warrior, each elder, each person with standing in the tribe would speak before judgment was rendered. Some argued for trading Elena to the Mexicans. Others suggested she could be useful as a servant or translator. A few older women, mothers who had lost children to disease and violence, spoke quietly about the empty spaces in their hearts that might be filled by caring for an orphaned child. Through it all, Elena remained pressed against KIYAH's side, her small fingers still clutching the wooden cross her mother had placed around her neck in what seemed like another lifetime. She was too young to fully understand that her fate was being decided by people who saw her as either opportunity or burden. But she was old enough to recognize that KIYAH was her only advocate in this circle of strangers. When the pipe completed its circuit and returned to Chief Neshoba, full darkness had settled over the canyon. The fire burned lower, and the assembled Apache faces had grown thoughtful and grave. This was not a decision that could be made lightly or quickly. "We will sleep on this matter," Neshoba announced. "Tomorrow, when the sun reaches its peak, we will speak our final words and choose Elena's path." The council dissolved slowly, tribal members drifting back to their shelters with heavy hearts and troubled thoughts. Whatever they decided would define not just Elena's future, but their own understanding of what it meant to be Apache in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything they held sacred. Elena woke to the sound of children's laughter echoing off the canyon walls, the first laughter she had heard since Jake Morrison dragged her from her family's burned homestead. The sun painted the eastern rim of their hidden refuge in shades of gold and amber, and for a moment the harsh realities of her situation seemed softened by the simple magic of dawn in the desert. KIYAH sat beside the cold ashes of their small fire, working with his knife on something small and delicate. His weathered fingers moved with surprising gentleness as he shaped dried corn husks into the rough outline of a human figure. Elena watched in fascination as he braided strands of long grass for hair, used thorns to attach tiny arms and legs, and carefully painted a face with berry juice. When he finished, he held up a small doll no bigger than his palm. It was crude by the standards of the store-bought toys Elena remembered from her former life, but it was made with the same love and attention she had seen her father give to important tasks. The doll's painted face wore a gentle smile, and its grass hair caught the morning light like spun sunbeams. "Parati," KIYAH said, offering her the doll with both hands in the formal manner Apache children were taught to give and receive gifts. Elena didn't understand the Apache words, but she recognized the gesture. Her eyes widened with wonder as she accepted the small figure, cradling it against her chest like something precious. For the first time since her rescue, Elena smiled. The expression transformed her dirt-streaked face, revealing the bright, curious child that still existed beneath the layers of trauma and terror. She held the doll up to examine it closely, then looked at KIYAH with something approaching trust in her dark eyes. "Gracias," she whispered, one of the few Spanish words KIYAH recognized. She tried to say something else, pointing to the doll and then to herself, but the language barrier remained an impermeable wall between them. Other Apache children had been watching from a respectful distance, curious about this strange Mexican girl who had appeared in their camp like a spirit from another world. Seeing Elena's obvious delight with the doll, they began to creep closer with the universal boldness of youth. The first to approach was Nalnish's younger sister, Desba, a girl of perhaps 10 years, whose own childhood had been marked by constant moving and hiding. She carried a small leather ball stuffed with pine needles, one of the few toys that had survived their many hasty relocations. Without speaking, she rolled the ball toward Elena, who caught it and rolled it back with a shy smile. Soon other children joined the impromptu game. Language became irrelevant as they played with the simple joy that children possessed regardless of their circumstances. Elena's laughter mixed with Apache giggles as they chased the ball around the small clearing where KIYAH had made their camp. But not all eyes watching the scene were friendly. Takoda observed from the shadows near his shelter, his expression dark with disapproval. To him, the sight of Apache children playing with their potential enemy represented a dangerous softening of necessary hardness. "She learns our ways too quickly," he muttered to Bidzil, who stood beside him with similar concern. "Children are easily fooled by a friendly face. They do not understand what her presence here means for our survival." Old Ayana emerged from her medicine lodge, drawn by the sound of playing children, a sound that had become all too rare in their diminished world. She watched Elena interact with the Apache young ones, noting how quickly barriers dissolved when fear was replaced by curiosity and kindness. "The spirits speak through children," she told KIYAH as he approached. "They see truths that adults miss because their hearts are not yet hardened by the world's cruelty." Elena looked up from her play and saw Ayana watching. The old medicine woman's face was kind but alien, marked by tattoos and scars that spoke of traditions Elena couldn't begin to understand. Yet something in Ayana's expression reminded her of her grandmother back in the settlement, the same mixture of wisdom and gentle authority that made children instinctively trust and obey. Clutching her cornhusk doll, Elena approached the medicine woman with careful steps. She held up the small figure, chattering in rapid Spanish that conveyed her delight and gratitude, even though Ayana couldn't understand the words. "She has a generous heart," Ayana observed to KIYAH. "This child could bring healing to our people if we let her." "The young ones have not smiled so freely in many seasons." The observation was true. Even the Apache children seemed lighter somehow, their usual wariness temporarily forgotten in the simple pleasure of play. For a few precious moments, the canyon rang with the sounds of childhood joy rather than whispered fears and careful preparations for the next crisis. But beyond the canyon walls, the adult world waited with its harsh demands and impossible choices. The tribal council would reconvene soon, and Elena's fate would be decided by considerations that had nothing to do with corn husk dolls or children's laughter. Yognalnish found the cavalry officer's brass button while gathering firewood near the canyon's eastern entrance. The polished metal caught the morning sun like a fallen star, winking up at him from between two weathered stones where it had rolled after tearing loose from a blue uniform coat. His hands shook as he picked up the small disc, feeling its weight and examining the raised eagle that marked it as belonging to the U.S. Army. The brass was still bright, unscarred by weather or time. This button had not lain here long, perhaps no more than a day or two. Nalnish ran back to the camp. With the speed of a man fleeing death itself, the button clutched in his sweating palm like a piece of molten metal. He burst into Chief Neshoba's shelter without ceremony, gasping for breath and gesturing wildly toward the canyon entrance. "Soldiers," he managed between ragged breaths. "They have been here close, very close." The brass button told a story more frightening than any war party's report. Cavalry scouts had approached near enough to lose uniform pieces on Apache ground. They were being hunted, tracked, perhaps even watched at this very moment. Within minutes, every warrior in the camp had gathered around Neshoba's fire, their faces grave as they passed the button from hand to hand. Each man understood its implications. The U.S. Army didn't send scouts into Apache territory for idle reconnaissance. They came to hunt, to kill, to finish what they had started at reservations and military prisons across the territory. "How many?" Chief Neshoba asked Nalnish, though they all knew the young man could only guess. "I saw no tracks, my chief, but they came close enough to touch our sentries' hiding places. If they were many, we would be dead already. If they were few—" He shrugged, leaving the implications unspoken. Takoda snatched the button from Bidzil's fingers, holding it up to catch the firelight. "This is what comes of harboring our enemies. The white men seek revenge for their dead cowboy, and we have given them a reason to find us." All eyes turned toward the corner of the canyon, where Eleanor sat with the Apache children, unaware that her presence had brought death's shadow to their hidden refuge. She was teaching Desba a Spanish song, clapping her hands in rhythm while the Apache girl tried to match the unfamiliar words. "We must move," urged Bidzil. "Pack what we can carry and find another hiding place before they bring more soldiers. And go where?" Chief Neshoba's voice carried the weariness of a man who had led too many desperate flights from too many enemies. Every canyon, every water source, every game trail, all watched now. "They have learned to hunt us like animals, and we grow weaker with each forced march." Old Ayana studied the brass button with the knowing eyes of someone who had seen omens in everything from cloud formations to the flight patterns of birds. "This button did not fall by accident," she said quietly. "It was placed here, left as a warning." The medicine woman's words sent a chill through the assembled warriors that had nothing to do with the desert's evening cool. A deliberate message was far worse than accidental discovery. It meant their pursuers were playing with them, demonstrating their power to strike at will. "Then they know about the girl," Takoda said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "They know we have her, and they know we killed their man. Every moment she remains in this camp brings us closer to destruction." KIYAH rose from his position beside Elena, his hand instinctively moving to check his father's obsidian knife. If they meant to attack immediately, they would have done so already. "This button is meant to frighten us into making mistakes." "What mistakes?" Takoda stepped closer, his young face twisted with barely contained rage. "The mistake of protecting our enemy's child. The mistake of letting sentiment override survival. Those mistakes are already made, old man." The confrontation between the two warriors drew Elena's attention away from her game with the Apache children. She could feel the tension crackling through the camp like electricity before a thunderstorm, could see the hard looks and angry gestures even if she couldn't understand the rapid Apache words. Captain Reynolds and his cavalry troop were camped less than 2 miles away, close enough to strike at dawn if they chose. But Reynolds was a patient hunter who understood that fear could accomplish more than direct assault. Let the Apache argue among themselves. Let them turn on each other over the Mexican child. Let them make the kinds of desperate choices that would lead to their own destruction. The brass button had been placed exactly where Reynolds knew it would be found, polished to perfection and positioned to catch the morning light. His Pima scouts had reported the Apache camp's location, the presence of the Mexican girl, and the growing division among the tribal members. Now Reynolds waited in his own camp, cleaning his cavalry saber while his men prepared for what promised to be the final hunt. The Apache were trapped between his troop and the desert, weakened by hunger and internal conflict, burdened by a child they couldn't abandon and couldn't afford to keep. "Perfect," Reynolds murmured, testing his blade's edge against his thumb and drawing a thin line of blood. The broken arrow shaft lay between Chief Neshoba and Takoda, like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with their world. Once it had been perfect, straight and true, carved from mountain ash and fletched with eagle feathers, blessed by the spirits for the hunt that sustained their people. Now it was snapped in half, its point buried somewhere in the desert sand, its proud feathers scattered by the wind. Takoda had thrown it at Neshoba's feet during their heated argument about Elena's fate, a gesture of disrespect that would have meant banishment in the old days. But these were not the old days, and desperate people did desperate things when survival hung by threads thinner than spider silk. "I will not watch my people die for the sake of one Mexican child," Takoda declared, his voice carrying across the canyon like a war cry. "If you lack the courage to make hard choices, others will make them for you." Behind him stood nearly half the warriors in the camp, young men who had grown up knowing only loss and retreat, who measured Apache's strength by their ability to inflict pain on their enemies rather than protect the innocent. They nodded agreement as their leader spoke, their hands resting on weapons they might soon use against their own people. Chief Neshoba remained seated beside his fire, but his weathered hand gripped his war club with white-knuckled intensity. "You forget yourself, Takoda. You forget who leads this band, and you forget what it means to be Apache." "I forget nothing, old man. I remember my sister, sold to Mexican slavers when she was younger than this girl. I remember my father, shot down by cavalry while carrying a white flag of truce. I remember promises broken and treaties burned, and Apache children left to starve on worthless reservation land." Takoda's words struck home because they were true. Every person in the canyon carried similar memories, similar losses, similar reasons to hate everything the outside world represented. Elena, playing innocently with her corn-husk doll near Ayana's shelter, embodied everything that had wronged them. "So you would become like them?" KIYAH stepped forward, his own followers gathering behind him, mostly older warriors who remembered what Apache honor had meant before survival became the only virtue that mattered. "You would sell children and break faith with those who trust us for protection?" "I would see my people live through another winter," Takoda shot back. "I would trade one Mexican girl for enough supplies to feed our families, enough ammunition to defend our hiding places, enough horses to outrun the cavalry patrols that grow closer every day." The canyon filled with angry voices as the two factions faced each other across the dying fire. Decades of accumulated grief and frustration poured out in accusations and counter-accusations that had little to do with Elena herself and everything to do with different visions of Apache survival. Some argued that trading Elena to Mexican authorities would buy them safe passage through federal territory. Others insisted that such a betrayal would mark them as collaborators, making them targets for every Apache band that still fought for freedom. A few suggested ransoming her back to relatives, while their opponents pointed out that dead families rarely paid ransoms. Through it all, Elena remained near Ayana's shelter, clutching her doll and trying to make sense of the anger swirling around her. The Apache children who had played with her earlier now kept their distance, sensing their parents' tension and understanding that the Mexican girl had somehow become the center of something dangerous. Old Ayana watched the confrontation with sad eyes that had witnessed too many such divisions over the years. Apache bands had always been fractious, prone to splitting apart when leaders disagreed about direction or strategy. But they had usually been able to reunite when external threats demanded unified response. This felt different, more final, more poisonous. "Listen to yourselves," she called out. her ancient voice somehow carrying over the younger men's shouting. "You sound like white politicians arguing over the price of a child's life while cavalry soldiers sharpen their sabers outside our canyon." The truth in her words momentarily silenced both factions, but the fundamental disagreement remained. Dakota and his followers saw Elena as a strategic liability that would get them all killed. KIYAH and his supporters viewed her protection as a test of Apache character that they could not afford to fail. Chief Neshoba stood slowly, his aged joints creaking like old leather. In his hands he held the 2 pieces of the broken arrow, studying them as if they contained some message from the spirits about how to hold his people together. "We will split into 2 groups," he announced, his voice heavy with defeat. "Those who wish to trade the child may take her south to the Mexican authorities. Those who wish to protect her may follow another path. But know this, once we divide, we may never be strong enough to reunite." The broken arrow shaft seemed to mock his words, its fractured surface catching the firelight like a prophecy of everything that was about to fall apart. Captain William Reynolds drew his cavalry saber from its leather scabbard, the polished steel reflecting the campfire's orange glow like captured lightning. The blade had been his grandfather's before him, carried through 3 wars and blessed with the blood of countless enemies who had dared oppose American expansion westward. Tonight it would taste Apache blood. "Sergeant Morrison," Reynolds called to his second-in-command, a grizzled veteran whose weathered face bore scars from a dozen frontier battles. "Have the scouts reported back?" "Yes, sir. The Pima trackers confirm the Apache are still holed up in Red Rock Canyon, maybe 40 souls total. They've got the Mexican girl with them, just like the ranchers reported." Reynolds nodded, testing his saber's edge against a piece of leather. The blade parted the material like water, sharp enough to split hairs or slice through Apache flesh with equal ease. He had spent the evening honing its edge to perfection, knowing that tomorrow's work would demand the finest tools. "Any sign they mean to surrender the child peacefully?" "Not likely, Captain. The Pima say there's arguing in the camp, but Apache don't give up their prisoners easy. They'd rather die fighting than show weakness." The captain smiled, a cold expression that never reached his pale blue eyes. "Then we'll accommodate their preference. At dawn, we surround the canyon and demand surrender. When they refuse, and they will refuse, we finish what should have been done years ago." Sergeant Morrison studied his commander's face in the firelight, recognizing the look that came over Reynolds when he contemplated violence. The captain had earned his reputation through ruthless efficiency in dealing with hostile tribes, but Morrison sometimes wondered if the man enjoyed his work a little too much. "What about the girl, sir?" "Our orders were to recover her alive. Our orders were to deal with the Apache problem permanently. If the girl survives, so much the better. If not," Reynolds shrugged, resheathing his saber with a metallic whisper, "casualties of war are regrettable but inevitable." 20 miles south, in another camp beside a different fire, Miguel Santos cleaned his own weapons with equal care but different intentions. The Mexican rancher had lost his niece, Elena, to Apache raiders 3 weeks ago, but unlike Captain Reynolds, he harbored no illusions about military justice or frontier righteousness. Miguel had seen what the cavalry did to Apache prisoners, had witnessed the aftermath of their pacification campaigns. He knew that Elena's chances of surviving a military assault were no better than her chances of surviving continued Apache captivity, perhaps worse. "Joaquin," he called to his eldest son, a young man whose quick mind and steady hands had earned respect throughout the territory. "Have you given more thought to my proposal?" Joaquin looked up from checking his rifle's action, his dark eyes reflecting the same determination that had made the Santos family successful despite constant frontier dangers. "I still think it's too dangerous, Papa. If the Apache don't kill us for approaching their camp, the cavalry will shoot us for interfering with military operations. And if we do nothing, Elena dies when the soldiers attack at dawn. I know Captain Reynolds by reputation. He shoots first and counts bodies afterward." The rancher had spent 2 days tracking the cavalry patrol. staying just close enough to observe their movements without revealing his own presence. He had watched Reynolds clean his weapons with the loving care of a man anticipating violence, had seen the brutal efficiency with which the soldiers prepared for what they clearly viewed as a massacre rather than a rescue operation. "There has to be another way," Miguel muttered, more to himself than to his son. "Some path between the cavalry's sledgehammer and the Apache's stone wall." But even as he spoke, Miguel knew the options were few and none of them offered guarantees. The Apache would never surrender Elena voluntarily. She represented too valuable a bargaining chip in their desperate struggle for survival. The cavalry would never accept anything less than complete Apache surrender, which meant death for most of the band, regardless of Elena's fate. Captain Reynolds stood and walked to the edge of his camp, gazing north toward the red rock formations that concealed his quarry. Tomorrow's dawn would bring the final confrontation he had been planning for months. The Apache had finally made a mistake, taking a white child, killing a white man, giving him the justification he needed to finish his campaign of extermination. His saber hung at his side, its weight familiar and comforting. 3 generations of Reynolds' men had carried this blade in service to American expansion, and it had never failed to deliver victory when properly applied. Tomorrow it would write the final chapter in the Apache story. In the hidden canyon, KIYAH held Elena close as she slept, her small body trembling with dreams he hoped were gentler than their waking reality. The corn-husk doll lay beside her on the rough blanket, its painted smile serene in the moonlight. The white flag of truce rippled in the morning breeze, its pristine cloth a stark contrast against the red canyon walls. Chief Nashoba had torn it from his own shirt, the last clean garment he possessed, and tied it to a mesquite branch with strips of leather that had once bound his war lance. It was a symbol of hope in a world that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. Captain Reynolds watched through his field glasses as the Apache chief emerged from the canyon's mouth, walking slowly with the makeshift banner held high above his graying head. Behind Nashoba came 2 other figures, the old medicine woman Ayana, and surprisingly, the warrior KIYAH carrying the Mexican child in his arms. "Brave of them," Sergeant Morrison observed, though his tone suggested he found their courage foolish rather than admirable. Most Apache would rather die fighting than surrender under any flag. "They're not surrendering," Reynolds replied, adjusting his field glasses to get a better look at the approaching delegation. "They're negotiating. Watch how the warrior holds the girl, close enough to protect, far enough to run if things go badly." The captain was right. KIYAH cradled Elena against his chest with one arm, while keeping his other hand free for the obsidian knife at his belt. The child seemed calm despite the circumstances, her dark eyes taking in the blue uniforms and bristling weapons with the solemn acceptance that trauma had taught her. Elena clutched her cornhusk doll tightly, the small figure's painted smile providing what comfort it could in a situation that seemed destined to end in violence. She had learned enough Apache words to understand that something terrible was about to happen, had seen the way the warriors checked their weapons and the women gathered their few precious possessions. Chief Nashoba stopped 50 yards from the cavalry line, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to retreat if negotiations collapsed. He planted the white flag in the rocky ground and raised his right hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. "I am Chief Nashoba of the KIYAH Apache," he called out in heavily accented English. "I come under the protection of this flag to speak of peace." Captain Reynolds spurred his horse forward, flanked by 6 mounted troopers with their rifles ready across their saddles. His cavalry saber remained sheathed, but his hand rested on its pommel in a gesture that mixed military protocol with barely contained threat. "I'm Captain William Reynolds, United States Army. You are in possession of stolen property belonging to Mexican citizens. Surrender the child immediately, and we will consider your request for terms." Nashoba's weathered face remained impassive, but KIYAH could see the muscles in the chief's jaw tighten with suppressed anger. The phrase stolen property reduced Elena to the status of livestock or merchandise, denying her humanity and Apache reasons for protecting her. The child was rescued from men who would sell her to slavers, Neshoba replied carefully. She is under Apache protection now. We will discuss terms for her safe return to her family, but we will not simply hand her over to soldiers who speak of children as property. Elena might not have understood all the English words, but she recognized the tension building between the two groups of armed men. She pressed closer to KIYAH, finding comfort in his steady heartbeat and the familiar scent of sage smoke that clung to his buckskin shirt. Captain Reynolds' cold smile widened slightly. You misunderstand your position, Chief. You are not negotiating from strength here. My soldiers have your canyon surrounded. You have nowhere to run, nothing to bargain with except the child. Give her up peacefully, and I might allow some of your people to live. The threat hung in the desert air like the promise of a thunderstorm. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as both sides weighed their options and measured their resolve against the potential cost of violence. KIYAH stepped forward, her ancient voice carrying surprising strength. Captain, I have lived through 70 summers and seen much war between our peoples. I have also seen peace, when men of honor chose wisdom over blood. Which man are you? Reynolds' expression hardened at the medicine woman's challenge. I'm a soldier, grandmother. I follow orders and eliminate threats to American citizens. Your people chose war when you took that child. Now you must face the consequences. Chief Neshoba felt the negotiations slipping away like water through his fingers. The white flag above his head seemed to mock the very concept of civilized discourse between enemies who had learned to see each other as less than human. Behind the cavalry line, Miguel Santos watched through his own field glasses, his heart breaking as he realized that diplomacy was about to fail. KIYAH raised his father's war shield just as Captain Reynolds' first shot shattered the morning silence. The ancient buffalo hide, painted with sacred symbols that had protected 4 generations of Apache warriors, absorbed the bullet's impact with a sound like thunder rolling across the desert floor. The shield's rawhide surface, blessed by medicine men and strengthened with prayers, held firm against modern warfare. The negotiations had collapsed the moment Reynolds drew his service revolver and put a bullet through the white flag of truce. Chief Neshoba fell backward, with blood spreading across his chest, the peaceful banner tumbling into the dust beside his still form. What followed was not battle but slaughter, as 20 cavalry rifles opened fire on 3 Apache representatives who had approached under sacred protection. Elena screamed as KIYAH threw himself sideways, rolling behind a boulder with the child clutched against his chest. Bullets whined overhead like angry hornets, chipping stone and sending razor-sharp fragments flying in all directions. The war shield, strapped to his left arm, became their only protection against the wall of lead that sought to claim their lives. "Stay down," KIYAH whispered in Apache, then repeated it in the few Spanish words he knew. "Quedas abajo." Elena pressed herself against the ground, her corn-husk doll forgotten in the terror of the moment. Old Diana had not been so fortunate. The medicine woman lay crumpled beside a sage bush, her traditional dress dark with spreading blood. But even in death, her lips moved in the old songs, calling upon the spirits to protect her people from the evil that had come to their hidden canyon. From the rocks above the canyon mouth, Takoda's war cry echoed like the shriek of a hunting eagle. The young warrior had positioned his fighters on the high ground before dawn, anticipating treachery from the white soldiers. Now his rifle spoke with deadly precision, dropping one cavalryman from his saddle and sending the others scrambling for cover. Captain Reynolds cursed as his perfectly planned ambush turned into a running firefight. The Apache had proven once again that they could not be trusted to die quietly when surrounded. His cavalry saber remained sheathed. This was a job for rifles and revolvers, not the elegant blade work he preferred. "Sergeant Morrison," he shouted over the gunfire, "take half the men and flank them from the east. I want every Apache in that canyon dead before noon," but the Apache were not cooperating with his timetable. Buzzards appeared on the canyon's western rim, his ancient musket booming like cannon fire as he targeted the cavalry horses. Without their mounts, the soldiers would become foot targets in terrain where Apache warriors could move like ghosts. KIYAH's war shield had been carved from the hide of a buffalo his great-grandfather had killed with arrows and prayers during the last great hunt. The animal spirit was said to dwell within the rawhide, offering protection to righteous warriors who fought to defend their people. Now that spirit faced its ultimate test against weapons that could kill from distances the buffalo had never imagined. A cavalry bullet struck the shield's center, directly over the painted thunderbird that represented the power of storm and sky. The hide absorbed the impact, but transmitted enough force to numb KIYAH's entire arm. He could feel the shield weakening with each hit, its sacred protection gradually overwhelmed by modern firepower. Elena looked up at him, with eyes that held no trace of childhood innocence. Too much violence, too much death, too much fear had aged her beyond her 8 years. But she did not cry, did not beg, did not surrender to the terror that surrounded them. Instead, she pressed her small hand against KIYAH's chest and whispered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. The battle raged for 2 hours as Apache warriors used every advantage their canyon stronghold offered. They fired from concealed positions, retreated through hidden passages, and struck without warning from unexpected angles. But they were outnumbered 4-1, and their ammunition was limited, while the cavalry seemed to have endless supplies. One by one, the Apache voices fell silent. Takoda's rifle stopped speaking from the eastern rim. Buzzards' musket ceased its thunder from the west. The canyon that had echoed with war cries and defiant shouts gradually filled with the moans of wounded men and the whispered prayers of those preparing to die. KIYAH's war shield finally failed when 3 bullets struck it simultaneously, tearing through the sacred hide and shattering the wooden frame beneath. The Thunderbird symbol disappeared in a spray of splinters and torn rawhide, taking with it the spiritual protection that had sustained his family for generations. But somehow, Elena still lived, still breathed, still pressed against his side like a small, warm flame in the growing darkness of defeat. The blood-stained peace treaty lay crumpled beneath Chief Neshoba's lifeless hand, its formal promises reduced to worthless paper by Captain Reynolds' bullets. The document, signed by government officials who had never set foot in Apache territory, guaranteed safe conduct for tribal representatives operating under flags of truce. Now it served as nothing more than a burial shroud for broken faith. KIYAH crawled from boulder to boulder, carrying Eleanor through the aftermath of battle while surveying the devastation that had consumed their hidden sanctuary. Bodies lay scattered across the canyon floor, Apache warriors who had died defending their people, cavalry soldiers who had fallen to desperate resistance, and innocents caught between opposing forces that recognized no middle ground. The silence was worse than the gunfire had been. No birds sang from the canyon walls. No insects buzzed in the desert heat. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in the presence of so much death. Only Elena's quiet sobs and the distant moaning of wounded men broke the profound stillness that followed violence. "Takoda," KIYAH called softly, as he found the young warrior propped against a red stone wall, blood seeping from a wound in his chest. "My brother, can you hear me?" Takoda's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on KIYAH's face. "The child?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Does she still live?" "She lives. You fought well, Takoda. Your father would be proud." A bitter smile crossed the dying warrior's lips. "I was wrong about many things, old man, but I was right about this. The girl brought death to our people." KIYAH wanted to argue, to defend his choice to rescue Eleanor from Jake Morrison's brutality. But surrounded by the corpses of friends and kinsmen, such arguments seemed hollow and self-serving. Perhaps Takoda was right. Perhaps some acts of mercy cost more than any people could afford to pay. Elena stirred in his arms, lifting her head to survey the carnage with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. She spotted Chief Neshoba's still form near the treaty paper and began crying again, not the hysterical sobs of terror, but the deep, heartbroken weeping of someone who understood that good people had died because of her presence. "No es tu culpa," KIYAH said in his broken Spanish, trying to tell her it wasn't her fault. But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. Elena hadn't asked to be rescued. She hadn't requested Apache protection. She had simply been an 8-year-old child, caught in circumstances beyond her control or understanding. Captain Reynolds appeared at the canyon entrance, his uniform torn and dusty, but his cavalry saber still pristine at his side. Half his men were dead or wounded, but he had achieved his objective. The Apache resistance in this sector was broken forever. His pale eyes surveyed the destruction with satisfaction rather than remorse. "Sergeant Morrison," he called to his surviving second-in-command, "collect the bodies. I want a count of hostile casualties for my report. What about our own dead, Captain?"
"Wrap them for transport."
"They'll be buried with military honors at Fort Apache. The hostiles can rot where they fell." Reynolds' gaze found KIYAH crouched behind his boulder, still holding Elena protectively. "And bring me that warrior and the girl, alive if possible." KIYAH closed his eyes and pressed his face against Elena's dark hair, inhaling the scent of sage and childhood innocence that still clung to her, despite everything she had endured. He thought of his daughter Ayana, buried in ground too hard for proper Apache rites. He thought of his wife Itzayana, who had died of grief and government rations. He thought of the corn-husk doll he had made for Elena, now lost somewhere among the scattered stones and spreading blood. "I cannot protect you any more, little one," he whispered in Apache. "I do not even know if I should have tried." Elena looked up at him with understanding beyond her years. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the dignity that KIYAH had taught her, through example. She had learned Apache courage, even if she couldn't speak Apache words. The blood-stained treaty paper rustled in the desert wind, its broken promises mocking every ideal that had brought this tragedy to pass. Government negotiators had written those words in comfortable offices, far from the reality of bullets and blood and children who paid for adult failures with their innocence. As cavalry boots approached their hiding place, KIYAH made one final choice. He set Elena gently on the ground and stood to face Captain Reynolds with empty hands and proud shoulders, ready to accept whatever consequences his mercy had earned. The sacred medicine bundle lay torn open in the canyon dust, its precious contents scattered by cavalry boots and rifle butts. Herbs gathered from sacred mountains, stones blessed by ancient ceremonies, and feathers taken from eagles that flew close to the Creator, all trampled into the dirt by men who saw only superstition where Apache hearts recognized the divine. KIYAH knelt beside the ruined bundle, his withered hands trembling as he tried to gather its scattered contents. Each item represented generations of accumulated wisdom, prayers whispered in darkness, and healing knowledge passed from medicine person to medicine person across centuries of Apache tradition. Now it all lay broken in the red earth, desecrated by those who understood neither its power nor its purpose. "It's over, KIYAH," Elena whispered beside him, her small hand touching his shoulder with surprising gentleness. Despite her youth, she had learned to recognize the look of ultimate defeat that now shadowed his dark eyes. "You tried. You saved me. That matters." But KIYAH could no longer see past the devastation his choice had wrought. Chief Neshoba dead beneath a flag of truce. Dakota breathing his last against a canyon wall. Old Ayana's wisdom silenced forever by cavalry bullets. The sacred bundle violated by men who would burn Apache traditions as readily as they burned Apache camps. Captain Reynolds approached with his remaining soldiers, his cavalry saber finally drawn and gleaming in the afternoon sun. The blade had waited patiently through the gunfight, but now it would taste the victory that bullets and treachery had delivered. His pale eyes studied KIYAH with the satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his prey. "Stand up, Apache," Reynolds commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 3 generations of military service. "Time to answer for your crimes." KIYAH rose slowly, his empty hands open at his sides. He had made peace with death during the long hours of battle, but he still hoped to bargain for Elena's life. The child had suffered enough for adult decisions and adult failures. "The girl is innocent," he said in careful English. "She has done nothing to deserve your anger. Let her go to her family." Reynolds laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a carrion bird. "Innocent? She's the reason good American soldiers died today? Her existence in this camp made this battle necessary." The captain's words struck KIYAH like physical blows. He had spent sleepless nights questioning his decision to rescue Elena, but he had always believed that protecting innocence was worth any personal cost. Now Reynolds was suggesting that innocence itself could be a crime if its protection inconvenienced the powerful. Elena stepped forward, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "I want to go with KIYAH," she declared in halting English, the words carefully chosen from her limited vocabulary. "He is my family now." The statement hit KIYAH harder than any bullet could have. This Mexican child, who owed him nothing and understood little of what protecting her had cost, was choosing to stand with him in the face of certain death. Her loyalty humbled him and broke his heart simultaneously. "Touching," Reynolds said mockingly. "The savage has trained his pet well, but I'm afraid both of you have appointments elsewhere." The captain raised his saber, its polished steel catching the desert light like captured fire. This was the moment he had anticipated through every mile of pursuit, every hour of preparation, every bullet fired in anger. The blade would write the final chapter of another Apache story, adding one more victory to his family's military legacy. But as Reynolds prepared to strike, a rifle shot echoed from the canyon entrance. The captain spun toward the sound, his sword wavering as he searched for the source of this new threat. His remaining soldiers raised their weapons uncertainly, unsure whether they faced Apache reinforcements or some other danger. From behind a jumbled pile of boulders stepped Miguel Santos, Elena's uncle, his smoking rifle trained on Captain Reynolds' chest. Behind him came a dozen Mexican vaqueros, their own weapons drawn and ready. They had arrived too late to prevent the battle, but perhaps not too late to influence its aftermath. "Captain," Miguel called out in accented English, "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Elena's eyes widened with recognition and hope. "Tio Miguel!" she cried, the Spanish words tumbling from her lips like prayers answered. But she did not run to him. Instead, she pressed closer to KIYAH, her loyalty unchanged by the appearance of blood relatives. The medicine bundle lay forgotten in the dust as three forces faced each other in the blood-stained canyon. Apache warrior, American cavalry and Mexican civilians, each with their own understanding of justice and their own claims on one small girl's future. Elena's mother's wedding ring caught the desert sunlight as she pulled it from its hiding place beneath her torn dress, the small band of gold gleaming like a beacon of hope in the midst of so much death and despair. She had kept it secret through everything: Jake Morrison's brutality, the Apache rescue, the canyon battle, protecting it as her final link to the family she had lost and the love that had created her. "Mira, Tio Miguel," she said softly, holding up the simple ring for her uncle to see. "Mama told me to keep it always, so you would know I was truly Elena Santos if we were ever separated." Miguel's weathered face crumpled with emotion as he recognized his sister's wedding band, the one she had worn through 15 years of marriage and motherhood before Apache raiders destroyed their peaceful settlement. His rifle trembled in his hands as years of grief and desperate searching culminated in this moment of recognition and reunion. "Dios mío," he whispered, lowering his weapon. "Elena, mi niña. We thought you were dead. We searched everywhere, asked every trader, questioned every traveler. How did you survive?" Elena looked between her uncle and KIYAH, torn between the blood family she had lost and the protector who had risked everything to save her. The Apache warrior stood silent and dignified despite his wounds, prepared to accept whatever judgment these Mexican relatives might render. "KIYAH saved me," Elena said simply, slipping the wedding ring back beneath her dress. A bad man was going to sell me to slavers, but KIYAH killed him and brought me to his people. He made me a doll and taught me to be brave." Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his cavalry saber still drawn, his pale eyes calculating the new dynamics that Miguel's arrival had introduced. "This is touching family reunion, but it doesn't change the fact that this Apache killed American citizens and harbored stolen property. Military justice takes precedence over civilian sentiment." Miguel's vaqueros shifted restlessly behind their leader, their hands moving to their weapons. These were hard men who had fought Comanche raiders, Apache war parties, and American expansion with equal determination. They understood that sometimes justice had to be taken rather than granted by authorities who served distant interests. "Captain Reynolds," Miguel said carefully, his English carrying the formality of a man conducting dangerous negotiations. "My niece says this Apache saved her from slavery. In my country, we have great respect for those who protect innocent children, regardless of their race. Your country lost this territory in the war," Reynolds replied coldly. "What matters here is American law, and American law demands payment for American blood." Elena stepped between the two men, her small figure dwarfed by the adult conflict swirling around her. But there was nothing small about her voice when she spoke. Nothing childish about the moral authority that 8 years of suffering had granted her. "KIYAH is a good man," she declared in careful English. "He could have left me to die, but he didn't. His people could have traded me for food. But they didn't. They died protecting me instead." Her dark eyes blazed with passion that reminded Miguel painfully of his murdered sister. "If you hurt him, you are no better than the bad men who killed my mama and papa." The canyon fell silent, except for the whisper of desert wind through scattered stones. Even Captain Reynolds seemed momentarily taken aback by the moral certainty in a child's voice. The way innocence could cut through political justifications and military necessities to expose the simple truth beneath. KIYAH placed his hand gently on Elena's shoulder, pride and sorrow warring in his weathered face. "You have your family now, little one. That is what matters. Do not concern yourself with what happens to an old Apache warrior." But Elena shook her head fiercely, her fingers finding the wedding ring beneath her dress and drawing strength from its connection to love and sacrifice. "You are my family too. Mama's ring reminds me that family isn't just blood, it's the people who love you enough to die for you." Miguel studied the unlikely pair, the Apache warrior, who had sacrificed everything to protect a Mexican child, and the child who refused to abandon her protector even when blood relatives offered safety. The wedding ring his sister had worn represented not just marriage, but the broader bonds of loyalty and love that transcended tribal boundaries and racial hatred. "Captain," Miguel said finally, his decision crystallizing as he watched Elena cling to KIYAH with desperate determination, "I formally request custody of both my niece and her Apache guardian. As Mexican citizens, we claim the right to determine our own justice." The standoff that followed would determine whether love and loyalty could triumph over the machinery of frontier violence, whether a child's wisdom could prevail against adult brutality, and whether a simple wedding ring could bridge the gap between different worlds, seeking the same fundamental truths. The faded family photograph trembled in Miguel's weathered hands as he pulled it from his leather vest. The sepia-toned image cracked from years of careful folding and unfolding during countless searches for his missing niece. It showed the entire Santos family gathered for Elena's 7th birthday, her parents, grandparents, cousins, and uncles all smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of people who believed their world was permanent and secure. "Look, Elena," Miguel said softly, kneeling beside his niece in the blood-stained canyon. "Remember this day? You made us all sing Las Mañanitas 3 times because you said the first 2 weren't loud enough for the angels to hear." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she studied the photograph, her small fingers tracing the faces of family members she would never see again. There was her mother, Maria, wearing the same wedding ring that now rested beneath Elena's torn dress. There was her father, Carlos, with his gentle smile and carpenter's hands. There were her grandparents, who had told her stories of brave princesses and magical horses during long summer evenings. "They're all dead," Elena whispered, the words carrying a weight that no 8-year-old should have to bear. "The Apache came in the night and burned everything. Mama hid me in the root cellar, but they found me anyway." KIYAH felt each word like a knife to his heart. He had not participated in the raid on the Santos settlement. His band had been elsewhere, struggling to survive on inadequate government rations. But Elena's family had died at Apache hands nonetheless, killed by warriors who shared his blood and traditions even if they didn't share his specific guilt. Captain Reynolds watched the reunion with calculating eyes, noting how effectively the photograph had reminded everyone present of Apache crimes against innocent Mexican settlers. This was exactly the kind of evidence he needed to justify his harsh methods and permanent solutions. "You see," the captain said, gesturing toward the image with his still-drawn saber. "This is why we must be thorough in dealing with hostile tribes. They show no mercy to white families, Mexican families, anyone who stands in the way of their savage resistance to civilization." But Miguel's response surprised him. Instead of demanding Apache blood for Apache crimes, the Mexican rancher looked at KIYAH with something approaching understanding. "War makes monsters of us all, Captain. Apache raiders killed my family, but American soldiers have killed plenty of Apache families too. Mexican federales have done their share of killing. The question is whether we continue the cycle or find another way." Elena pressed the photograph against her chest, over the hidden wedding ring that connected her to her mother's memory. "KIYAH didn't kill them," she said, with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "KIYAH saves people. He saved me." The Apache warrior remained silent, but his dark eyes held depths of sorrow that spoke of personal losses every bit as devastating as Elena's. He understood better than anyone the price that all peoples paid for the frontier's endless violence, the way death and revenge created cycles that consumed innocent and guilty alike. "What happened to my family was terrible," Elena continued, her young voice gaining strength as she spoke. "But killing KIYAH won't bring them back. It will just make more orphans and more sadness." Captain Reynolds' patience finally snapped. He had not tracked these Apache through desert wasteland and fought a brutal battle just to watch a child's sentiment undermine military necessity. His sword rose toward KIYAH's throat with the deadly certainty of 3 generations of cavalry training. "Enough philosophy," he growled. "This savage dies here and now, along with any Mexican fools who try to protect him." But as the saber descended toward KIYAH's neck, Elena threw herself between the blade and the Apache warrior, her small body shielding the man who had become her second father. The photograph fluttered from her hands, its precious image floating down to join the scattered contents of Ayana's medicine bundle in the canyon dust. "No!" she cried, her arms spread wide to protect KIYAH even though she barely reached his waist. "If you kill him, you have to kill me too, because I won't let you hurt my family." Miguel's rifle swung toward Captain Reynolds, its barrel finding the center of the officer's chest. Behind him, a dozen Mexican vaqueros followed their leader's example, their weapons trained on the remaining cavalry soldiers. The canyon that had echoed with Apache death cries now trembled on the edge of international incident. "Captain," Miguel said quietly, his finger steady on the trigger, "I suggest you reconsider your approach to justice. My niece has chosen her protector, and I have chosen to honor that choice." The faded photograph lay forgotten in the dust, its happy faces bearing witness to love that transcended death, loyalty that defied reason, and courage that transformed children into heroes. The 2-sided medallion caught the late afternoon sun as Miguel pulled it from around his neck, its polished surface showing both a Christian cross and an Apache thunderbird carved into opposite sides of the same piece of silver. He had commissioned it years ago from a Navajo silversmith, back when he still believed that understanding between peoples was possible, before war and hatred had poisoned the relationships between all the desert's children. "Eleanor," he said gently, kneeling beside his niece as Captain Reynolds's cavalry and his own vaqueros maintained their tense standoff, "I want you to have this. It belonged to your grandmother Santos, but she would want you to carry it now." Eleanor examined the medallion with wonder, turning it over in her small hands to study both sides. The cross was beautifully detailed, its arms decorated with tiny flowers that represented resurrection and hope. The Thunderbird was equally intricate, its wings spread wide to capture the storm's power and protect those beneath its shadow. "Why are there two different pictures?" she asked, her young mind struggling to understand how Christian and Apache symbols could coexist on the same piece of jewelry. "Because your grandmother was a wise woman who understood that truth has many faces," Miguel replied, fastening the medallion's chain around Elena's neck. She knew that the same God who watches over Mexican children also watches over Apache children, even when their peoples are at war. Captain Reynolds sneered at the display of cross-cultural sentiment. "Pretty words and prettier jewelry won't change the fact that this Apache is a killer who must face military justice. Your romantic notions about noble savages don't alter the reality of frontier law." But Elena was studying the medallion with the intense concentration of a child discovering something profound. The Thunderbird's fierce beauty reminded her of KIYAH's quiet strength, while the cross connected her to the prayers her mother had taught her during peaceful evenings that now seemed like fairy tales from another world. "Maybe," she said slowly, her young voice carrying unexpected wisdom, "maybe people fight because they only look at one side of things. Maybe they forget that other people have Thunderbirds too, or crosses, or other things that make them feel safe." Her words hung in the desert air like a challenge to every adult present. Here was an 8-year-old child, orphaned by violence and traumatized by events beyond her control, offering a perspective on peace that seasoned warriors and hardened soldiers had never considered. KIYAH looked down at Elena with profound respect. This small Mexican girl had endured more loss than many Apache warriors, yet she spoke of understanding rather than revenge. Her courage humbled him and reminded him why he had chosen to risk everything for her protection. "Captain Reynolds," KIYAH said quietly, his English careful but clear, "the child sees what we have forgotten. We are all human beings, trying to protect the things we love. You love your country. I love my people. Miguel loves his family. Perhaps these loves do not have to be enemies." Reynolds' grip tightened on his cavalry saber. "Don't lecture me about love, Apache. Love didn't kill Jake Morrison. Love didn't start this war. Love doesn't explain why your people can't accept civilization and live peacefully on the reservations we've provided." "And what of the love that brought you here?" Elena asked, her innocent question cutting through Reynolds's justifications like a blade through paper. "Did you come to save me because you love children? Or did you come to hurt people because you love hurting?" The question struck Reynolds like a physical blow. He had told himself that everything he did, the pursuit, the battle, the planned executions, served the higher purpose of protecting American settlers and maintaining frontier order. But looking into Elena's clear eyes, he was forced to confront the possibility that his actions were motivated by something far less noble. Miguel stepped forward, his rifle still trained on the captain, but his voice carrying the tone of a man seeking compromise rather than conquest. "Captain, my niece has made her choice. She wants to return to our family, but she wants her Apache protector to come with us. I'm prepared to take responsibility for both of them." "You're talking about harboring a known killer," Reynolds replied, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "I'm talking about providing sanctuary for a man who saved my family," Miguel countered. "In my country, such men are honored, not executed." Elena touched the medallion at her throat, feeling the cross and Thunderbird's raised surfaces beneath her fingertips. Both symbols promised protection. Both represented different paths to the same destination, a world where love was stronger than fear, where understanding could triumph over hatred. "Please," she said simply, looking directly into Captain Reynolds' cold eyes. "Choose the Thunderbird side. Choose the cross side. Just choose love." The medallion glinted in the dying sunlight, its dual nature reflecting the choice that faced everyone in the blood-stained canyon. The hand-carved wooden horse rested in Elena's weathered palms, its smooth surface worn by decades of loving touches from children who had grown into adults, then grandparents, then memories. KIYAH had spent countless evening hours crafting it from a piece of cedar that had fallen naturally from a sacred tree, using only his father's obsidian knife and the patience that 73 years of life had taught him. "For you, Elena," he said in Spanish, that had improved remarkably over the 15 years since their first meeting in that blood-soaked canyon. "So you will always remember that some gifts are worth any price." Eleanor, now 23 and radiant in her wedding dress of white silk and Apache beadwork, accepted the wooden horse with tears streaming down her cheeks. Around her, the courtyard of the Santos Ranch buzzed with celebration as Mexican and Apache families mingled freely, their children playing together while their elders shared stories and traditional foods that had become fusion cuisine through years of cultural exchange. The wooden horse was more than a wedding gift. It was the symbol of an impossible dream that had somehow become reality. When Captain Reynolds had finally lowered his cavalry saber 15 years ago, convinced by an 8-year-old's moral authority to choose mercy over vengeance, he had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would transform the entire region. Miguel had kept his promise to provide sanctuary for both Elena and KIYAH. The Apache warrior had become not just a member of the Santos family, but a bridge between two peoples who had known only conflict for generations. His knowledge of Apache customs and Mexican needs had made him invaluable as a translator, negotiator, and keeper of peace during the turbulent years that followed. "Abuelo KIYAH," called little Carlos, Elena's 5-year-old nephew, tugging at the old Apache's buckskin pants with the fearless affection of a child who had never known racial hatred. "Tell us the story about Mama Elena and the bad cowboy." KIYAH chuckled, lifting the boy onto his lap with arms that remained strong despite his advancing age. Around them gathered a dozen children of mixed heritage, Santos grandchildren and adopted Apache orphans, Mexican cousins, and Navajo friends who had found refuge on the expanding ranch that had become a sanctuary for anyone seeking a different way of life.
Again?
KIYAH asked in mock surprise. "But you have heard this story 100 times. 101, insisted little Carlos. "Tell it again." As KIYAH began the familiar tale of rescue and redemption, Elena moved through the wedding celebration with quiet grace, accepting congratulations from guests who represented every corner of the Southwest's complex cultural landscape. Her groom, David Rivera, was himself the son of a Mexican mother and Apache father, a union that would have been unthinkable before Elena's courage began breaking down the barriers between peoples. The wooden horse seemed to catch and reflect every beam of sunlight that filtered through the cottonwood trees Miguel had planted around his courtyard. Its carved features showed remarkable detail. Flowing mane, proud stance, alert eyes that seemed to watch over the celebration with benevolent wisdom. It had taken KIYAH 3 months to complete, working only during the peaceful hours after sunset when his aged hands were steadiest and his memories clearest. "Do you remember?" Elena asked Miguel as they watched KIYAH enchant another generation of children with his stories. "When you were certain this could never work? When you thought adopting an Apache warrior would bring nothing but trouble to our family?" Miguel smiled, his hair now completely white, but his eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had built a ranching empire from the ashes of tragedy. "I remember. I also remember a little girl who was brave enough to stand between a cavalry saber and the man who had saved her life. That little girl taught this old fool that courage comes in small packages sometimes." The celebration continued into the desert evening, with Apache drums joining Mexican guitars in music that had never existed before Elena's wedding day, but sounded ancient and eternal nonetheless. Children who spoke 3 languages fluently played games that blended traditions from all their ancestries. Adults who had once viewed each other as mortal enemies now shared meals and laughter and hopes for grandchildren who would know an even more integrated world. As the wooden horse caught the last rays of sunset in its polished grain, Elena understood finally why KIYAH had chosen this particular gift for her wedding day. It represented motion without destination, strength without aggression, beauty that required no justification beyond its own existence. It was, in other words, everything that love could become when people were brave enough to choose it over fear, understanding over hatred, hope over the bitter certainties that had once seemed like the only truth worth defending. The wooden horse would sit on Elena's mantelpiece for 60 years, watching over children and grandchildren who would grow up in a world where Apache lullabies were sung in Spanish, where Mexican prayers included Cherokee names for God, where wooden toys carved by weathered hands carried the promise that love, once planted, could grow into forests that sheltered everyone.